engineer, actually. IARPIC is led by the federal agencies. So two of our colleagues on this team are members of federal agencies. And IARPIC promotes cooperation among federal, state, academic, and other organizations to advance Arctic research. So our particular team aims to strengthen coastal resilience by sharing information on coastal resilience and by facilitating collaborations. And so in this meeting, in particular, we're going to introduce members to coastal erosion forecasting and mapping. That's what Jacquelyn is going to speak to. And we're also going to highlight community-based coastal resilience efforts. And Sophia will talk about her experience in Shaktoolik. So with that, I believe that we can move to Jacquelyn's presentation.
All righty, figure out how to share the right screen. Are you seeing the presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Thanks. Well, thanks for having me today. Love any opportunity to work with folks and talk about the work that we do, but mostly how we collaborate with others. Like I mentioned, I work at the state and we are primarily focused on mapping, monitoring, and modeling flood and erosion hazards. However, it doesn't really stop there. In order to get the information to community members and to get the information into the plans that community members are using to deal with these issues. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is how we collaborate in order to do this effort. There's a lot of communities that have issues and require some level of data collection or risk assessment, and then also get into the specifics of the erosion exposure assessment that we did. As Jocelyn had mentioned, that was funded by the Denali Commission. So I probably don't need to mention this to this group, but there's the statewide threat assessment that the Denali Commission completed back in 2019 found that there were 144 Alaska Native communities that were most threatened by flood, erosion, or permafrost hazards. And so those are the red and the yellow dots on the map. There are additional dots of communities that may have some level of threat. They're just not as threatened. And that's a huge amount of communities to think about spread over a really large geography with very different issues at each community. It's also mentioned that 4.3 billion is required to protect existing infrastructure from environmental threats over the decades to come. So this is a very large issue from the financial perspective as well. However, most communities don't currently have access to baseline risk assessments to quantify the magnitude or severity of the issues in their community, and that's a major issue for a lot of reasons. So that is the main background for the work that we do and the collaborative process. So folks that I work with at the State of Alaska Division of Community and Regional Affairs, as well as the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, we put together a project that was funded by the National Coastal Resilience Fund to help build capacity and conduct risk assessments with Alaska Native communities. And the whole idea behind it is to have this first step of assessing vulnerability, then working with engineering firms to identify solutions to those issues, which would then give communities capacity to take actions to reduce that risk and continue to monitor once those actions are taken. And that could be a very different process for any given community. The best answer might be to protect in place, maybe some sort of managed retreat, either moving homes back from an eroding riverbank or shoreline or raising them up above the floodplain, or wholesale relocation of an entire community, similar to what Newtalk's approach has been. So this is the group of agencies that are within that collaboration currently, and we take each of our skill sets that we have and try to make progress with communities. And so it really starts with the baseline data that's required in order to understand vulnerability of a community, and that's within the geologic survey. So not only do we collect data, but we have other partners that do collect data as well. And then we form that into some sort of map product, like the erosion exposure assessment, that is really community-based and formatted so that communities can utilize that for their planning process. And then we have Sally Cox working directly with DCRA, who is a longtime community planner with the state and is working with communities through FEMA processes in order to utilize the map data to make those near-term and long-term plans to protect infrastructure. And we also have the ANTHC Center for Environmentally Threatened Communities involved, and they're sort of involved in all aspects. Really, they're working with communities in order to apply for grants to do additional work, maybe collect some of the data, or even go through implementation. So this is the schematic that we have put together for that. And you can see, DGGS will be primarily doing the red portion, handing off to planning, and then implementation, actually looking for projects that are going to make a difference for the hazard. So what are the gaps and what is being done? I mentioned that, not only DGGS is collecting data, but other agencies are as well. And there's 144 communities that are most threatened. That's a lot of communities to try and keep track of. So another thing that the Denali Commission funded was the development of this online database where we could actually track who's doing what and provide any resources that come from that effort in an online format. So this is actually publicly available. You can access it through our main website at the Coastal Program DGGS site, and starts to get at coordination amongst organizations and amongst different types of data sets, because really there is a stepwise process that communities can go through in order to assess their risk and get in projects going. And so we want to make sure that communities have access to each step of that. Even the communities themselves might be contracting with an individual engineering firm, and that data is delivered to the community, but it's not necessarily passed on to future contractors or state or federal agencies that might be looking to assist. And so really this is a resource that we would like to see some folks gain use in. Primarily, there's a lot of DGGS data that's hosted in this database, and ANTHC has direct access to edit this. So as they're applying for grants, we can move projects from pending to in progress to complete, and they're working with so many communities on developing these projects that it makes sense that they help edit this. But we do want to get additional input from other folks doing work and make sure that we're tracking those projects as well, because the issue is so big that we can't have too much overlap. It makes most sense for everyone to do their individual part. But this dashboard primarily is answering the questions of who is doing what and where, and when is it planned for completion, and once it is completed, providing access to the final product. And an example of that is just taking one of those data sets, for example, topography, and mapping out which communities have topography and which don't. I'm working with some various groups, interagency working groups, the Alaska Mapping Executive Committee and the Alaska Geospatial Council Coastal and Ocean Technical Working Group, where we are, surveying folks to see what their needs are for mapping, but also just looking for those gaps and trying to fill them with the many federal dollars that are coming in through the infrastructure bill and the recent pass of the federal budget. And so because of that, we're able to identify these large areas where riverine communities have not had access to this data and have applied for funding to get coverage for those. And we'll continue to do that. So the various things that we're tracking in this database, obviously raw and published data, but also studies that actually show what the vulnerability is for a particular community. So I've highlighted the shoreline change assessment and the erosion exposure assessment as components of that, because I'm going to talk in more detail about those. But we are also tracking flood assessments. DGGS conducts some historical flood assessments, flood modeling efforts, if there's published flood model data that's out there. For example, I mean, we've got Ann on the phone, and so there's a USGS model that was developed for a few communities, St. Lawrence Island and Unalakleet. And so we provide access to that report, that final report in the database, and so on. So some of those assessments that have been completed, for example, the shoreline change assessment, it took quite a bit of time and advance in processing of geospatial data in order to measure shoreline change for Alaska communities. Before we completed this report, there were the GAO reports, if you're familiar with those, and the statewide threat assessment that call out the number of communities that might have an issue, but we want to know how much of an issue is it. So we started out with just quantifying the historical shoreline change rates, and that was utilizing aerial images back from the 1950s that we orthorectified and basically draw the shoreline through time and quantify that change. So that's what this map shows, is the maximum rate of shoreline change at communities. But even that doesn't necessarily get us at the vulnerability of those communities, because, for example, Kaktovik, there is very fast erosion. However, it's not near any community infrastructure, although other areas are still very important. If your concern is primarily protecting infrastructure, then this map won't be representative of which communities have the biggest issues. So in order to address that, what we've done is we created a forecast from the historical shoreline change trends, pushed that into the future, and overlapped it with the infrastructure data. And so obviously that assumes that the historical erosion is going to stay the same into the future, which is a huge caveat, but also is a great indication of what could come, and our best effort that we can make right now for such a large group of communities. So we're forecasting that forward at its regular rates and or at a consistent rate. And we had to do quite a bit of work just to get the infrastructure data files into a format that we could do any analysis. They were previously infrastructure files provided on Division of Community and Regional Affairs community profile maps. And those were all in AutoCAD. We converted them to ArcGIS, provided some metadata, did some updates based on the imagery that we had, just so we could get that overlap. And through geospatial analysis, define, which buildings, which lengths, segments of road were vulnerable to erosion. So here's an example of one of the final maps, and this is a pretty extreme example, but at Napakiak, they have very severe channel migration of the Kuskokwim River and quite a bit of infrastructure that's in the way of that. So you can see we have those 20-year intervals that we forecasted into the future and identified the infrastructure within those zones. I guess I didn't mention, and we have some people interested in some economists on the phone, and so I should have probably gone into more detail on our cost assessment. I will just say that what we've utilized, we worked with some engineers at ANTHC to get some very generalized numbers of what it costs to build certain types of infrastructure in rural Alaska. So all across Alaska use the same number. One building, for this much square feet, this is how much it'll cost for this much road. So we did compute it out by size in some cases, and in some cases just by a single facility. So for example, a barge landing, we just used a flat rate on how much it would cost to replace that. But these are really good just estimates for community members to look at the map and start to prioritize what infrastructure where and when, so that they have a general idea of the magnitude of the issue for their community. And already this map has been incredibly useful. We provided it to the governor's office in response to the issue of the school in Napakiak. And that school was recently moved to the top of a list for priority for construction in the years to come, because it's so apparent that the erosion is going to impact that building very quickly. And here's an example of Geophysical, where they're using this map to prioritize infrastructure. Obviously, their infrastructure is, there's a few buildings more spread out over a longer time period of potential impact. And so they can do that, and they can select a few buildings at a time and piecemeal develop solutions for their community. They did get interviewed by KYUK, along with a representative in Nunam Ikwa and myself. Really great radio article just on how people are utilizing these maps in Western Alaska, from Nunam Ikwa, where they didn't think erosion was such a big deal that they took a look at the maps and decided, okay, maybe we do need to develop some long-term plans, to Geophysical, where they're actively working on plans from this information right now. Now, we weren't able to forecast erosion forward for all communities. One of the reason for that was because this is a linear forecast. So we're expecting erosion to be progressing through time. However, many communities in the coastal zone experience episodic erosion. The shoreline is very dynamic. Even the shoreline is managed with some sort of existing infrastructure that's there. And so they may have experienced historically rapid erosion rates and now less so. It doesn't make them less vulnerable to erosion. It just makes the situation more complicated. And in that case, we didn't have a sufficient method in order to quantify their exposure to erosion, but we do recommend that those communities move maybe to the next level of assessment, which could be a hydromorphodynamic model that will give them more information of what potential future erosion could be from specific storm events, with various climate change scenarios and changes in wind and wave patterns. So I provided the example of Shaktoolik because I knew Sophia was going to be coming up next, and that was a report that Golder completed where they showed the potential not only in current conditions but future conditions of what the what a single erosion event could cause to the community. So with that, you heard my timer. I had to time myself to make sure I stayed in the 15 minutes. But thanks for having me today and hearing a little bit about this. There's tons of online resources. I would just say go to them. And if you have questions about specific communities, I am more than happy to answer them, or about the reports themselves. We generally have an overview report that provides information about the whole study, and then individual community reports that are just the maps and any specific analysis to that community. And I think with that, I can, oh good, folks are adding links in the chat, so thank you for doing that. But I'll go ahead and stop sharing and can move on in the agenda. Is there time for questions?
Yes, so we have 5 minutes for questions. So I'm sure there's some questions. So who would like to lead off with a question for Jacquelyn?
I have a question. Hi, thanks for that presentation. Lots of really good information that your group is developing. So I took a look at the story map that you sent a link around before the meeting. And at the very end, there was a section about engineering analysis. And I was just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that and what it entails.
Sure. So Generally, ANTHC, their CETC program works directly with communities to potentially put a engineering firm on retainer or for specific projects to move from what we have in our maps to an actual plan that discusses the state of the current infrastructure, how they would move it, where they would move it, and a better cost assessment as well. I mean, the cost assessment we've done is very broad and very loose, and so they do need site-specific cost assessments associated with that. And so oftentimes I find myself providing our data directly to an engineering firm so that they can take it to the next step for the community.
And just for kind of a more complete picture, so how is that prioritized? Like, which communities get that engineering firm's assistance? Who makes that decision? How is that determined? Maybe you don't know, but I would love to hear more about that.
Well, I mean, it's all dependent on what the community has resources to do. And so there's a couple of different federal funding sources that have been used successfully in this model. So the BIA Tribal Resilience Program, that is a funding source for tribes, and they can access that, and then they fund the engineering work through the tribe directly. So they go out and ANTHC, what they're doing is providing additional assistance in that whole process and developing the project, and then identifying a contractor. One really great resource has been part of the statewide threat assessment from the Denali Commission, were some really generalized scopes of work that communities could utilize to say, hey, we do want to go to the next step if we're going to find an engineering firm to work with. We can provide this to them to scope out the work for our community. And usually they hone in on that a little bit for the specific community, but it's a great starting point.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Jackie, can I quickly ask, during the coastal mapping, did you notice the land accretion or land gain, or is this significant to consider?
Yeah, accretion is the other half. Sediment has to go somewhere. It doesn't always just go offshore. So accretion is not something that we included in our exposure assessment. We looked at erosion alone there, but our shoreline change assessment does show where shorelines have been accreting. And that can cause a couple of issues in especially communities in Bristol Bay that are have a lot of infrastructure in the water, such as fish processing facilities or landing sites for docks. And the tide range is so large there that they're very muddy areas anyway, hard to access. So any infilling of those facilities is definitely a challenge for them. Yeah.
Hey, great talk. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on like the erosion forecasting you did. Like, was that just forecasted based on the erosion rates themselves, or does it include responses to different environmental factors that might change, like sea ice or temperatures or whatnot? Like, how was that done?
Right. No, this is the simplest modeling you can think of. So taking those historical rates and moving them forward. There were definitely cases where erosion protection structures were built in place, and we made a buffer around those to show that they're doing their job, and we don't expect erosion to go beyond them. But as far as any other changes in conditions or things like that, we don't have the ability to utilize those types of factors in this modeling, and to do it for so many communities. This is the first broad brush to say, okay, what's the situation for these communities? And already we're finding that it's very helpful information. Now, if a community is going to utilize this information for, say, relocation planning, then they might need to evaluate whether this assessment really fits all their needs, and maybe they should have some hydrodynamic modeling conducted that does take into consideration not only current conditions, but potentially even future conditions.
Thanks.
Well, that was a great presentation and a great set of questions. Maybe it's time to move to Sophia's presentation, and then we'll have another opportunity to ask additional questions after that.
And Sophia, this is Liz Weinberg. I have your slides. I'm going to share them right now. So I'm on your first slide, and you can just tell me when you'd like me to move on.
Okay, well, you're on the first slide.
She is.
Okay, community-wide protection, relocation, and expansion. Go ahead and go on to the second one.
All right, you're on the second slide now.
Okay, so this is my hometown, Shaktoolik, Alaska. It's located on the east shore of the Norton Sound. We've been having erosion issues for many years now, and I took this job in 2018 and worked well with Bristol Engineering and interagency and the state of Alaska. We all worked together to get grants that were for the need of our community, you know. But you can go on to the next one.
Great, you're at the next slide.
In 2019, we had our first storm, which, I mean, we've had storms in the years prior, but this was our last big storm in August of 2019. In the pictures, you could see what damages it did from the left to the right. Took about half of the berm. And at the bottom picture, you know, if you can compare the left side picture is just covered in water in the back of that house here to the right. And the next one is just more pictures from that storm. If you can go to the slide 4.
Great, I'm on slide 4.
Yes, the first picture was just taken past the old site, which is 2 miles south of Shaktoolik. That was, you could see the road right there to the left up there, and that berm that was there eroded quite a bit. And further down there on the road, it's narrowing, so, and they're trying to protect that place so we don't become an island. And second picture is below my mom's house. Usually it's further down. The bank is at least 4 or 5 feet further down where it ends, but that's how high our water got. And a couple other pictures to show you. That last picture is our cannery, our fisheries cannery, and the boat that was parked by it. It's just surrounded in water. And go ahead and go on to the next one. I'll just start from the beginning. In 2019, we did a survey with Golder, and you know, we are good to protect in place right now, but I believe we are going to be starting the planning process of relocation because later on down in the years, you know, we are going to probably be covered in water. But I worked well with Bristol Engineering and ANTHC. We wrote wrote a grant through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and we got $1 million. With that $1 million, we were able to purchase 2 dump trucks, a water truck, and use the rest for wages and equipment, supplies, and rentals. We also got another grant with HUD ICDBG. That was to, we have a berm in front of our community on the ocean side that was built first in 2014 after the 2013 storm. And that berm lasted about 5 years because in 2019, that's when the berm eroded. And the Denali Commission allocated some funds to repair that berm that year, and we used local labor and local material. This picture is the crew we have working on our berm. The ICDBG grant was just to cover the most important areas in front of town, which was in front of our tank farm, in front of the school and whatnot. We also got another grant through HUD, the imminent threat grant. This was the grant for the berm past the old site where I was telling you it was narrowing. And we got that grant also, and most of them should be expended this season. We initially started in we started last summer, 2021, and we are hoping to finish this year. And you can go to the next one.
Great. On the next slide.
I would like to apologize. I kind of did this slide last minute, and I am just feeding information off of my memory. But this one, it was a survey we did in 2019. We handed out 65 surveys, but 40 of them were returned, and 30 out of the 40 people stated that they would move with the community. And that survey alone got us some answers that we needed. But, you know, where we live, it's this is where we subsistence, you know, this is where we're, you can look into the next slide, last slide, subsistence, our way of life. We put away fish, we pick berries, we hunt for all the foods on the land and in the ocean and the river. And but I do know in the future we are going to have to relocate. I don't know if it will be during my time, but Jolene Aulai, she is the new community coordinator, and she'll be taking the lead on this for the future. But I just wanted to give you guys a little view of what we have done in the last few years. This summer, last year, we did an escape route lighting project. We have lights from the U.S. Coast Guard that's going up our river in case we do have to evacuate during a flood or a storm. And those lights are, the community is happy with them. I hear nothing but good remarks. And summer, we will be working with BGGS, and we will be installing a tower on the ocean side with cameras overlooking our ocean, you know, so we could, you know, know what our storms are looking like and whatnot, so we can have better information. But that is all I have right now.
Well, thank you, Sophia.
Was informational enough for you guys.
Does anyone have any questions for Sophia?
This is Jacquelyn. I just wanted to say thank you, Sophia. That's so great. It's been wonderful working with you, and you're doing such a great job.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
So Sophia, I had one question. I heard that, and I've seen some figures showing that you use driftwood in that berm. to sort of maybe the idea was that the driftwood would sort of strengthen the berm and make it more erosion resistant. Do you have any kind of sense of whether the driftwood was helpful, or did it really not really help, or do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, they did use driftwood. I mean, our beach is consisted of lots of beechwood. We have beechwood all along our coast, and they did use that for, the bottom, and we just filled the gravel on up. And, last summer we were supposed to plant some ryegrass on the berm, which should have, which should keep them, keep it more stable, in other words. But we kind of had some COVID issues last fall, and it shut down the project. But we are going to be doing that this summer, and we're hoping to have more data for that, for the grass planting. So sometime by next summer or the year after, we should know how the grass will be doing for that berm, because little ways past town there was some natural grass that planted on the berm, and when we did get that 2019 storm, that one portion of that berm with the grass, there was hardly any erosion, but just maybe the very bottom part of it. So the grass itself right there kind of gave us hope that this will work for our berm in front of town.
Great.
Tom, I just noticed Kathy had her hand up. And so I just wanted to invite Kathy, though she had her video on. But Kathy, did you want to ask a question?
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to thank Sophia for that very nice presentation. Same applies to Jacquelyn, but Sophia, very interesting project, and thanks for the updates. I think it's really interesting, the survey that got sent out to the community, and I can just only imagine, I guess, just the impact of, people saying, yeah, they would move, but just what a huge thing that has to be in people's lives. So, just sharing that with us is just really informative to hear what one community is going through.
Thank you.
I'll echo what Kathy said. Just thank you so much, Sophia, for sharing. I was in Utrecht in the fall of 2017, which is when we had a big storm that was then declared a disaster, and really kind of changed the geography of the town overnight. And so seeing those photos reminded me of that experience and the community response, and the project of building the huge berm we now have along the coastline in Utrecht, which did radically change, I think, in some ways, how we relate, or how I, as somebody who was relatively new to the community at the time, but still noticed the change, related to kind of the coastline. It used to be, you'd be in friends' houses looking out over the ocean, and suddenly now we have this huge berm kind of separating town, making this divide between town and the ocean that used to be very natural. I wonder, it sounds like there already were berms in Shaktoolik. As you guys have responded with infrastructure, with new infrastructure, preventative infrastructure, has it changed at all how people kind of relate to the coast or go out to the beach or anything like that, if that makes sense?
No, everyone still enjoys the beach. Everyone, except, during this storm, nobody is on the beach because the waves are literally, hitting off the berm, in other words. So like say I'll do one instance last December, the very last week of December 2021, we had some high winds and didn't do no damage to us, but we were able to see that, you know, we had some pretty big icebergs out in the ocean, so, and a lot of ice buildup on the ocean side and next to the airport, so yeah.
Well, thank you, Sophia. It's great to hear, you know, firsthand accounts of coastal resilience, and to hear, you know, about your efforts to sort of stem the tide, if you will. So at the very end of our program, where we only have 3 minutes left, we like to ask our team members if they have any, you know, updates that they want to provide. So is there anyone who has some information that they'd like to share about coastal resilience? This is a good time to hear. I will actually lead off with one. I have a grad student, Anna Miller, who recently did a project to estimate the cost of flooding at Hooper Bay. And it's sort of a little bit like it parallels the work that Jackie talked about, estimating the cost of erosion. And one of the things that Anna Miller also did was look at different techniques for mitigating the flood hazard, such as raising the elevation of the roads or building dikes around much of the community. If anyone is interested in that study, we actually published a paper on it, and you happy to share that around if anyone's like to know about that. Are there any other announcements anyone feels they want to put forward here?
Yes, real quick, the Denali Commission's FY23 work plan is on our website, and it includes some funding for the Village Infrastructure Protection Program. And then we also have our implementation work plan for the Infrastructure and Investment in Infrastructure and Jobs Act funds. Thanks. On our website, www.denali.gov.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Does anyone else have an announcement? Well, I guess then that's probably going to be the end of our meeting. Thank you all for participating. Thank you in particular to our presenters. Excellent presentations. Look forward to seeing you at another Coastal Resilience meeting.
Thanks, everyone. The recording will be posted later this week. Have a great day.
Thank
Thank you.